Well, it is my duty at this point to interrupt your conversations, but I have to say I'm happy to do so because we have a great treat in store for all of you this afternoon, because it's my great honor now to introduce the former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson, who will present the luncheon keynote address. A pioneering advocate for human rights, President Robinson now serves as the Chancellor of Trinity College Dublin and as the United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Change. She previously served as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. President Robinson is founder and president of the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice, whose mission is to secure global justice for people vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Mary Robinson studied law at Trinity College Dublin and then won a postgraduate fellowship to Harvard Law School. As a professor at Trinity College's School of Law, a barrister, and a member of the Irish Senate for 20 years, she sought to use law as an instrument for social change, arguing landmark cases before the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court in Luxembourg, as well as the Irish courts. As President of Ireland from 1990 to 1997, she continued to advocate for human rights. She also offered support to developing countries and made a series of trips to Africa to draw attention to the continent's long-standing problems with famine and genocide. From 1997 to 2002, as United States High Commissioner for Human Rights, President Robinson made it a priority to integrate human rights into all the activities of the United Nations. President Robinson is the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including America's Presidential Medal of Freedom, presented to her by President Barack Obama. She exemplifies the highest ideals of law, scholarship, and public service, and we are very grateful to have her participate in this conference. Please join me in welcoming President Mary Robinson.
I'm really delighted that the Princeton-Fung Global Forum decided to come to Dublin this year and to focus on modern plagues, lessons learned from the Ebola crisis. I had the pleasure of meeting a number of participants yesterday evening in Trinity College, including President Gruber, William Fung, and others. And I made the point that the conference had come first to the other university, but my foundation is linked also with University College Dublin, so I'm equally at home in this university, and very glad to be back here in the fine O'Reilly Hall. I'm also delighted that I have to call them old friends. Dr. Margaret Chan and Peter Piot are here for this conference as well, because we have worked together over the years in a number of ways. And the first thing I'd like to say is that, of course, I am not an expert on health, as is clear from the very generous CV that the introduction of me. But I do feel that I've learned quite a bit about right to health. And I think it's quite relevant to what we're discussing here at this forum. When I had finished my 5 years as High Commissioner for Human Rights in the United Nations, I felt that there was a lack of focus on rights that are very important when you're in situations of poverty and conflict. And they are rights to food and safe water, health, education, and shelter. And so I established a small NGO called Realizing Rights. And we were going to pioneer how you work on economic and social rights as an NGO, and we focused on African countries. And I had quite a lot of interaction with Margaret Chan in particular during that period when she took over as Director General of the World Health Organization. And we worked in supporting governments in Africa, and a number of countries in Africa, to strengthen their health systems. We encouraged the ministers of health in their discussion with the ministers of finance in the government. And then, because we were an NGO, we tried to hold the government accountable. And we linked with civil society in the country to try and do that. And it was a kind of pioneering of a slightly different way of working on human rights, because NGOs like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, etc., who had tended to focus more on civil and political rights, would generally be naming and shaming. That was the name of the game. You know, accusing, naming and shaming, pointing out the pitfalls and the gaps. But if you're working on economic and social rights, you've got to help countries to build their systems, whether it's their health system or education or whatever, and then try to hold them accountable. And I really found that very interesting work. As it happened, I was in Sierra Leone literally a few days after the president had announced, and it had been announced earlier, but he had implemented access to free health care for pregnant women and children under 5. I was there, in fact, with, in part with Concern, who were present on the ground in Sierra Leone, and I saw the huge queues at the clinics. Suddenly, it became clear that because of the earlier user fees, so many pregnant women and parents of young children simply had not been able to access medical care. And in a way, I'm interested that Sierra Leone, notwithstanding trying to build access of pregnant women and children and and strengthen their health system, was one of the countries deeply affected by Ebola. I'm not an expert on the Ebola crisis. I think it's interesting, and I'm sure you're studying the fact that there were really 5 countries that were at risk, and 3 of them became the countries where it took hold in a very worrying way: Guinea, Sierra Leone, and say that again? Liberia, which I spent a lot of time in. And Senegal and Nigeria managed to contain and not let it spread. And I think there are huge lessons there, because they clearly had systems that were resilient enough to help them to resist. What I wanted to focus on a bit more, because it's closer to my experience and knowledge base, if you like, is that it does seem as if human rights were not very respected in the 3 countries that were desperately trying to cope with this huge crisis. Over and over again, there was a lack of respect for the human rights of those in the population community. There was a lack of adequate protection of health workers. There was a lack of understanding of the gender dimensions of the problem. There was a certain sense of overuse of quarantine in very cruel circumstances, where there was no knowledge in the population of why they were in quarantine, how it would affect them, and that spread the fear. And I think we must learn at least one important lesson, which is that we have to be more rights-based in our health work. We have to understand that the more we empower communities themselves, the more we work with communities and strengthen them, the more we can avoid at least some of the problems. And I think one of the lessons of the Ebola crisis is relevant to the SDG 3 commitments that are now signed off in September for all countries and come into effect on the 1st of January of 2016, and how we address the commitments and indeed the strong sense of wanting to not only expand on the MDGs, but make it a universal system that would apply in all countries and that we can kind of learn from each other. And I want to come back to SDG 4, but I think I want to just note the reasons why it appears that the 3 countries that were most affected suffered so much. Clearly, they were post-conflict countries. They had weak health systems and few basic public health infrastructures, and so they were not really able to withstand the shock. And this was compounded by the fear and by the lack of respect, full respect for human rights. There wasn't an ability to have the vigilance for the cases that actually spread from Guinea to Liberia and Sierra Leone. So they weren't able to combat in the way that Nigeria and Senegal were. There was no single there isn't any single way, as was mentioned this morning in the panel that I heard part of, to bring an epidemic like that under control. It's a matter of using all the ways of doing it, but I would say in a more rights-based way. And also, I do think, as I've mentioned, that the community engagement is extraordinarily important. I wanted to tell you about the discussion that we had in the group of elders who met just a few days ago in Evian in France. We meet twice a year, and we tend to look at all the crises, Syria, various Myanmar, all the issues of difficulty, and try to address them. But we also have taken stands on broader issues. For example, a couple of years ago, we decided to prioritize early child marriage, and we managed to sort of encourage a much greater take-up of various organizations that were addressing it that became Girls Not Brides, a kind of global campaign against early child marriage, or to encourage countries not to move away from early child marriage. And we have decided in the elders to use our moral voice, our moral compass, if you like, to focus on 3.8 of Goal 3 of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's an interesting goal because it's a goal that doesn't have any year attached to it. It's very linked, I think, to 3.7. So let me read out 3.7 first and then 3.8. 3.7 says, by 2030, ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health care services, including for family planning, information, education, and the integration of reproductive health into national strategies and programs. And I think this links with the way we want to address 3.8. 3.8, without any year, so I'm not quite sure what the indicators will be when these are worked out by next March, says, achieve universal health coverage, including financial risk protection, access to quality essential healthcare services, and access to safe, effective, quality and affordable essential medicines and vaccines for all. We decided to focus on this because we believe it's the most important and the most necessary. And we decided to say we want universal health coverage with particular focus on women and children, because we were given a lot of expert information as we addressed this issue. And in a number of countries, when there is a decision to expand health coverage, you start with the elites, with civil servants, with the military, and not with the poorest, not with women and children in particular, even though for women in particular, their needs are very significant. So we will try to, as I said, use our moral voice and link together those two parts of the Sustainable Development Goals because of the necessity to learn that if you have very weak health systems, then you're going to have pandemics, epidemics, crises of the kind that we've seen. One point that I worked on with my colleagues in Realising Rights, and we brought it to the World Health Assembly, and I talked to Margaret Chan many times about it, and then the World Health Assembly passed, was it a declaration or whatever it was, on health worker migration. You can't build health systems if you don't have health workers. And the trouble is, you know, health workers are still migrating from countries of high health problems and under-provision of health workers. And there is still a tendency in the countries that they go to, whether it's Ireland, other parts of Europe, whether it's the United States, whether it's to think of the individual health worker as gaining from moving to a higher income, to a safer country, to whatever it may be, and not to think of depriving under-resourced countries of their health workers. And we, in that work that we were doing, wanted countries that took health workers from poorer countries to pay for the education and training of at least one, if not more, further health workers in that country. And I think we need to really think seriously about that problem. And the other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit, because I want to talk about it from a health perspective, is climate change. It's quite clear, and you know this, that the the warming that we're already seeing from climate change is causing health vectors to change, causing malaria to spread, causing dengue to become a problem where it wasn't a problem before. And this must be a very real worry to health professionals, because if you're not used to coping with an issue, it's much more difficult. And I think climate change will have this impact in a significant way as we go forward. I do hope, and I am rather hopeful, that we will get a climate agreement in Paris. I think there's a huge political will to ensure that we get a climate agreement, but we already know it won't be enough, because we have the intended commitments of the 156 countries that have already given their commitments, and the United Nations has just done a professional study of what this means. And the result is that if everybody did everything they have promised in their commitments, then we would be on course for a 2.7 to 3 degree world. And there's a certain tendency to say that's much better than we thought, because we thought maybe 4 degrees. It's hard to say much better, because anything over 2 degrees is dangerous. You know, 2 degrees is not a safe area. It's above 2 degrees that is dangerous. So many NGOs are rightly saying, and small island states are saying, 1.5 degrees, please. That's what we should be aiming for and really trying to achieve. And so we know that Paris will be about taking a step in the right direction, but knowing we'll have to increase the ambition, we'll have to have reviews, we'll have to have verification, very close monitoring and verification, to make sure that countries do what they are committing to do, and that we have a safe world for our children and our grandchildren, but we're not on course. However, we are potentially able to turn that around in a climate justice way. Climate justice focuses on the fact that climate change has the most impacts on the poor countries and poor communities, even in richer countries, who are least responsible, because they don't drive cars, they don't have central heating, they don't manufacture in a large way and cause emissions, but they are the most affected. And therefore, we have to turn the climate justice around and say, this is where we need the priority when we address climate change. And my foundation has compiled a report called Zero Carbon, Zero Poverty, the Climate Justice Way. And we actually show that every country has to work together and move at the same time to address climate change. We can't sort of give a huge leeway to developing countries to use fossil fuels because they need energy. If we do that, we will run out of the carbon budget for the whole world. What we need to do instead is to recognize the leadership that is needed, which will be different in different countries. In the richer parts of the world, the industrialized world that benefited from fossil fuel, we have to cut emissions more, and we have to provide the necessary technology and financing so that developing countries can develop without emissions, develop without using fossil fuel. Now, no country has done that. The countries that are now moving to renewables had the benefit of fossil fuel. It is a huge challenge, and it needs a great deal of solidarity from all countries if we're to get there. But it has huge potential health benefits if we can get renewable energy to those who don't have renewable energy. The 1.3 billion, which the International Energy Agency estimates, who don't have access to electricity. And then that other figure that stays with me, the 2.6 billion who still cook on open fires with coal and wood and animal dung and inhale indoor smoke. And we know from the Lancet recent reports just how many millions die every year because of that. And of course, many of them are women and the children who are gathered around them under the same air pollution. So there is a huge nexus between environment, health, climate change, a huge connection, which is why I'm really interested in the issues that you're addressing in this important conference. And I have to say that I often borrow an expression of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He was, for a number of years, chair of the elders. He's now kind of an elder emeritus. He joins us when he wants to, and Kofi Annan has taken over the chair. But he and I were on a panel in New York, about 2 or 3 years ago, and we were facing an audience of young people using social media. You know, that was a particular kind of focus. So they were young and bright and doing their social media. And Archbishop Tutu gets very excited when he's in front of young people. And he was very, kind of enthusiastic and excited. And the journalist who was monitoring our conversation and monitoring the Q&A with these young people turned to him and she said rather sharply, she said, "Archbishop Tutu, why are you so optimistic?" And he looked at her, and he turned, and he shook his head. He said, "Oh, no, dearie," and he called her dearie. "Oh, no, dearie," he said, "I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope." And it's a kind of very strong affirmation. I think we all have to be prisoners of hope in some of the difficult areas that we're working on. And that's my attitude towards this climate agreement. It is so incredibly important that next month in Paris, we will get a climate agreement. And I want to share with you in conclusion just a little story that I'll be telling tomorrow when I speak to the representatives of governments of the International Energy Agency. I'm giving a talk on big ideas. There's a seminar on big ideas, and they've asked me to give the first one. And I'm going to talk about a conference that took place in Paris in 1878, which was an exposition on electricity. And Thomas Edison was the star. He was coming with his electric light bulb. And they actually had light bulbs in the Avenue de l'Opera and in the Place de l'Opera. And at a certain point, a switch was switched, and the world saw the future. These light bulbs, electricity, how exciting. But it wasn't until 1937 that an economic plan in France rolled out for most people electricity. It was only the elites in Paris and only in parts of Paris and some other major cities who had access until then. But the real sort of point that I'm making at the end is there was another innovation at that conference in Paris. Another person got a gold medal for his innovation, which was solar. He showed how you could produce energy from the sun, and he did it quite effectively. It was a clumsy gadget, but it worked. And the French decided that coal-generating electricity was the way to go because it was much cheaper, and therefore they cut the funding of this guy with his solar energy. And you wonder if they had known then what we know now and had gone solar, and the world had, what a difference it would have made. So there are always these moments of change, and for us in a very real sense, and for you particularly as health professionals, as experts in health areas and plagues and pandemics, this is an incredibly important year because we have these two big agendas. The Sustainable Development Goals, which comes into effect for all countries on the 1st of January, and this climate agreement, which itself won't come into effect until 2020, but between now and 2020, we have to use the Sustainable Development Goals, including the goal on climate, to live sustainably, something that no country has achieved to date. We have to live sustainably with Mother Earth, and that is the kind of challenge which Pope Francis spoke about so wonderfully in his encyclical, and which we need the moral and political voices to give a lead on, as well as the economists and the climate experts from a scientific perspective. And we need to be prisoners of hope, because we've got to get through this and get to a better world of renewable energy and better health for all. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, President Robinson, for that wonderful and uplifting keynote address. We are now concluded for the luncheon. We have a 30-minute break before we begin our next panel at 1:45. So please join me in thanking President Mary Robinson one more time for joining us here today. Thank you.